Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. A while back, I shared with you all my favorite JRPG on every Nintendo home console, and we're way overdue for a follow-up. So this time I'm going to talk about my favorite PlayStation RPGs, if that's okay. If that is okay with you, can you hit the like button? That'll let me know I'm good to continue. Okay, cool, sweet. Thanks. Before we dive in though, would you mind subscribing if you're not already? It helps me out so much. All right, let's get into it. With a system as JRPG heavy as the PlayStation, it's a bit daunting to have to choose a favorite. It is without a doubt one of the finest collections of JRPGs in console history. Sure, systems like the Nintendo Switch are at least giving a run for its money, but at the time, it was like a freaking renaissance of RPGs, and I was just so there for it. The trio of Final Fantasies are among the most beloved in the entire series. Well, okay, maybe -8, but I also love 8, so I tend to tune out the haters on that front. Then you have the friggin' sequel to friggin' Chrono Trigger with Chrono Cross, with some of the best graphics on the console and one of the best soundtracks of all time. The first two Wild Arms, the Lunar Games, Grandia, Suikoden. It's nuts. But the game that tops them all for me, both at the time and to this day, is Xenogears. Xenogears was the first game from Monolith Soft's Tetsuya Takahashi. He's the genius behind Xenosaga and Xenoblade, in case the similar names didn't already tip you off. His blending of psychology and philosophy and giant robots was exactly what I craved as a teenager, and it's something I honestly have just never grown out of. Give me a reluctant pilot with voices in his head and a mysterious woman with a tragic past, and sprinkle the whole thing with Jungian psychological principles, and I'm all over it. If you're unfamiliar, here's the basic premise. Xenogears is about Fei Fong Wong, a martial artist with amnesia whose peaceful life is completely obliterated when a bunch of giant mechs start a battle in his tiny village, seemingly at random. This leads him on an unbelievably epic quest to understand his own history and the history of his entire planet. I've joked before about JRPG main characters being a bunch of amnesiacs who have to kill God. Well, Fei is the proto-protagonist. He is the amnesiac godslayer that all other MCs long to be. The rest of the cast is made up of a mishmash of people from different backgrounds, including a deposed prince, a couple of little girls, and Blanca from Street Fighter II. Not wanting to be outdone by its peers, it features not one, but two completely different battle systems, one for on-foot battles and one for mechs. Both are fun in their own right, but I'll give the edge to the on-foot battles for the combo system it employs. Graphically, it hits a sweet spot for me with 32-bit JRPGs. Charming 3D rotatable backgrounds and 2D sprites just feel so right. Sure, it can be hard to tell where you're going sometimes, and it employs horrid platforming on occasion, but other than that, it's wonderful. And the soundtrack! Yasunori Mitsuda was coming in hot off the heels of his Chrono Trigger soundtrack, and since so many of the Chrono Trigger team were involved in Xenogears, he came on board to deliver one of the most beautiful scores in history. The themes in this game are still in my head to this day. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I think it's only fair to point out that Xenogears feels somewhat incomplete. It famously ran low on budget, and rather than run the risk of ending the game prematurely and betting on a sequel that might never come, Takahashi crammed the final third of the story into the second disc, and had the characters largely narrate the events from an Evangelion-style folding chair under a spotlight. This is not great. But considering what a detriment that is, it should tell you something that Xenogears is still my favorite JRPG on the PlayStation. Its highs are so much higher than its lows, and it will always have a special place in my heart. Are we ready for some hot takes? My favorite PlayStation 2 JRPG is a Tales of game, and it's probably not the one you're thinking. It's something of a black sheep in the broader Tales community, and I don't think that status is really warranted. I'm talking about Tales of Legendia, and boy, it's an odd one. See, Tales of Legendia was made by a different team than the core Tales of series, though it was in collaboration with many of the Tales team members. While the main series was exploring 3D action combat, Legendia decided to create a parallel line of games that stuck with fighting on a 2D plane. This line of games died off pretty quickly. I don't know anything about sales numbers for the series, but I'm guessing it didn't do so hot compared to the mainline games. Regardless, I've never let popularity stop me from enjoying things, which is why I still style my hair like I did when I was 16 years old. Tales of Legendia Legendia takes place aboard a gigantic ship known as the Legacy, and not the Legendia for some reason. You'd think that would be a gimme, but no, these games tend to like keeping their names nonsensical. Anyway, this ship is more like a movable continent, as it has all the hallmarks of your average landmass, including mountains, valleys, cities, all that good stuff. You play as Senel, a young guy who is here to rescue his sister Shirley, who's not really his sister and is in love with him because, you know, this plotline comes up in a lot of JRPGs and anime. What's going on, guys? Stop. Just stop it. Anyway, one of the most unique things about Tales of Legendia is the way its plot is structured, and I would argue that this is its weakest point. Keep in mind, what I'm not saying is that the plot is bad. I think it's actually very good, but some weird decisions were made in how to structure it, and I want to talk about those briefly. See, the game is basically split into two halves. The first half is an epic quest to save Shirley and do all the sorts of things you might expect to do if you're involved in an epic quest, like battling bandits and fighting the evil spirit of the ocean. That sort of thing. It's great! And then when you've succeeded here, the game continues. The second half of the game is made up of interesting character plot lines where each character takes the focus for a bit. These stories are also very cool, and they resolve into a final battle with the requisite big bad. The reason I'm critical of the structure is, honestly, I feel like they should have merged these two halves. We should have had the character stories woven throughout the main plot rather than giving us two medium-sized climaxes. Just give us one big climax to end things off. Now, maybe that sounds like a big complaint, but I promise you it does not negatively affect my view of Legendia at all. I still love this game, and that's primarily because of the story, the characters, and the music. One thing I love about the game is the way the characters are portrayed so realistically. Even the AI of your party members is adjusted to give them a fighting style that matches their personalities. Shirley, for example, seems like she would be a meek and mild background character, maybe shooting off some healing spells and staying out of the fray. In reality, and in matching with her personality, she is one of the most aggressive characters and will leap to the front lines if you let her. The interactions between her and Senel and the other party members just make her seem so charming, despite her ill-advised helmet bangs. Before I move on, I need to take a moment to talk about the music. This was the first soundtrack I ever heard by Go Shiina, and it was enough to turn me into a super fan. Contrary to the music in the other Tales of games, the soundtrack here is so memorable. It's so busy in a way that somehow manages to be pleasing to the ear, which is an achievement in itself. Highly recommend this soundtrack. Anyway, moving on. I had to sneak a little Trails game onto this list, you know I did. I'm so predictable. In that way, I'm like a comfortable old sweater. I smell like mothballs, and I looked my best 10 years ago. Anyway, Trails of Cold Steel 2 is the 7th entry in the Trails series, and it builds on the solid foundation of Trails of Cold Steel 1 by taking the cast of characters we fell in love with and dropping them into the most horrific situation most of them could imagine. Anyone who was expecting more school life simulation was in for a rude awakening, because this game shoots off in a completely different direction from the get-go. Cold Steel 2 still stars Reen Schwarzer, the dark-haired Adonis adored by every teenage girl he encounters, and a surprising number of grown women. Which, I mean, come on guys, that's not realistic. I'm not even talking from the perspective of like, oh, this is so problematic. Not even my point. My point is grown women are not interested in this kid. Whatever, but Reen is great, and even though no one can unseat Estelle in my heart as my favorite protagonist, he puts on a darn good showing. His fellow party members are terrific as well. Even though some people in the fandom are sort of over Class 7, I'm still a fan. A ton of varied personalities are in the mix, but they all just love each other, and it's so freaking heartwarming. It's great. The combat is more of that Trails goodness, and like every game that came before it, it introduces just enough newness to keep things interesting. In this game, that takes the form of Divine Knight battles, aka Gundam. Technically, the very end of Cold Steel 1 gives you a chance to fight in Valimar, Reen's giant robot friend, but Cold Steel 2 gives you a bunch more opportunities to go nuts in a mech suit. The story is more complicated than the previous entry, since Cold Steel 1 was all about setup and foundation laying. Cold Steel 2 is a story of civil war between the old-fashioned noble faction and the newfangled reformist faction, with Class 7 taking the role of me in any argument between my friends and trying not to tick off anybody too much, while simultaneously attempting to bring about a third possible outcome. Yeah, you play as a bunch of idealistic kids. What are you gonna do? Trails of Cold Steel 2 is a truly epic conclusion to the first half of the Cold Steel saga, and it in turn lays the groundwork for so much more greatness to come. I desperately wanted a PSP when it came out. Even though I wasn't as big into video games at the time, it just seemed like such a cool device. It was basically a PS2 you could fit in your pocket. How insanely cool was that? When I finally did get one, I quickly discovered I didn't actually like playing on it all that much. At the time, I was not only not big into video games, I was extra not big into handheld gaming. So the PSP collected dust. Until Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. See, Crisis Core was a return to the world of one of my favorite childhood games. In a series that was not widely known for releasing multiple entries in the same universe, this was a rare taste of more Final Fantasy VII. I grabbed this game right away and I devoured it. The combat was fun enough, but I didn't spend a ton of time on the side content. I was there for the story, to get to see Zack and Aerith and even Cloud in their lives before the events I knew so well. It's funny, playing a prequel, you sort of go into it with a different set of expectations than you do an original story. Like, I knew where this was going. I'd seen the bit in Final Fantasy VII featuring Zack, so I was not anticipating any surprises. But something happened to me as I played. I sort of forgot. I mean, not literally. If you'd asked me what happened to Zack before Final Fantasy VII, I could have told you easily. But seeing his story firsthand, getting to experience his character so fully, I somehow buried that knowledge in the back of my brain and just went along for the ride. I desperately wanted a happy ending to his story. But again, I played Final Fantasy VII. The ending of Crisis Core left me a mess. Literally, I wish I had taken a picture of myself. It was not a pretty sight. That's just how effective and powerful this game is. And now that it's widely available remastered, there's literally no excuse to not grab it for yourself and see just why so many of us love Zack Fair so darn much. Blue Reflection on the PS4 was a very expensive game, at least when I bought it. It cost me nearly $200 from a vendor at a classic gaming convention. I scoured the whole floor looking for another copy for a better deal, but this was the only copy available. I took it home, and I decided there was no way I could let this game sit in the backlog. This was the most I'd ever spent on a used game before. I worried that my opinion of it would be clouded by the fact that I spent so much money on it. Psychologically, my brain would want to defend me from feeling like a chump who wasted that much on something subpar. So I did my best to keep those inclinations at bay and truly experience Blue Reflection for what it was. I had some quibbles, but overall, I was blown away. The music, the graphics, the vibe, it was all so chill and beautiful. I loved it. Its sequel, Blue Reflection Second Light, is a masterclass in how to iterate on a formula to make across-the-board improvements. Maybe that sounds too clinical, but it's really accurate. The developers at Gust must have been paying attention to the response to the original because they made a game that essentially improves on it in every single way. A huge cast of interesting characters, much more variety in dungeon design, a much more moving and impactful story. The things that worked, they kept going. The music, the visual aesthetic, everything just came together so wonderfully in this game. In case you're not familiar, Blue Reflection Second Light is a sort of magical girl story about some teenagers who are stranded on an island in the middle of nowhere, except this island has a school on it, and all their needs are met somehow despite no one else being around. They travel to various other worlds that are modeled after their pasts and have to face their traumas as they work to figure out exactly what is going on. It's a solid story, and it has an extremely likable cast of characters. But above and beyond the easier to describe things, there's that vibe. The thing that sold me on the original game despite its shortcomings. This is somehow cozy despite having one of the most frantic and active turn-based battle systems I've ever played. It's a huge step forward for the entire genre, and I hope other developers are learning good lessons from it. If they do, we all stand to benefit. Okay, this probably isn't a surprise to anyone because Persona 4 Golden was the system seller for the Vita. It's the definitive version of one of the greatest JRPGs of all time. A JRPG that I missed the first time around on the PS2. This was my first real Persona experience, and I was not ready for it. I came in skeptical, but I came out a lifelong fan of these games. This sold me so thoroughly that I even started delving into the more esoteric Shin Megami Tensei games that came before it. Persona 4 Golden presents a series of murders setting up a central mystery of a serial killer in a small town that somehow is managing to kill people without leaving any trace whatsoever. In that Persona sort of way, the answer ends up being found in a secret world that exists inside of televisions. A group of teenagers gain the ability to summon personas, these giant, powerful beings that are representative of their inner selves, and they make their way through the TV world attempting to thwart whoever this crazy person is. This was probably my first real interaction with social simulation style gameplay. See, when you're not diving into the television like Captain N, you're going to school, hanging out with friends, getting a part-time job. all the things you do outside the TV can end up having an effect on your stats and abilities inside the TV. Becoming better friends with your teammates can increase their skills and subsequently increase the strength of the personas you can use. It's such an addictive gameplay loop, and it makes the 100+ hours you'll spend in the game feel like it just flies by. It's great that Persona 4 Golden is more widely available now. Until it gets the reload treatment, this is the best way to play this story, and if you somehow haven't given it a shot yet, I highly recommend it. I've mentioned this before, but the Tales of series is what got me started collecting video games. My brother always raved about these games, and I'd somehow never played a single one, so I decided to start picking them up until I picked them all up. And then I didn't stop and started picking up every RPG I could find. A handful of questionable life choices later, and here I am on YouTube. Whoops! But anyway, Tales will always have a special place in my heart, not just because they're almost universally great games, but because of what it means to me in this stage of my life. Tales of Arise was the first JRPG I picked up for the PlayStation 5. It remains the best one I've played. Now, the cynical might simply point out that, well, in all honesty, there haven't been that many JRPGs put out on the platform yet. And that's true. Final Fantasy XVI definitely gives this one a run for its money, but I'm going to keep Arise in the top spot for the time being, and that largely comes down to the characters. See, the Tales of games tell charming stories, but they're rarely super deep and complex. What really makes these games shine are its characters. Their colorful personalities are always on full display, and getting to watch their interactions with each other is always a major highlight. This is one of only a few series that dedicates a significant amount of time to simply letting the characters speak with each other. This is done through skits, which are just short scenes that you can watch from time to time. They're usually completely optional too. Tales of Arise continues that tradition, but this time ups the ante by adding an interesting, motion comic aesthetic to the whole proceeding. It just enriches an already excellent piece of the game's storytelling, and I hope Bandai Namco continues iterating on this going forward. The action combat's quite a bit different than previous entries, but I got used to the changes pretty quickly, and found the game pretty darn fun overall. It was challenging at certain parts as well, which normally I don't seek out, but if a game can challenge me without frustrating me, then I give it extra points. And that describes Tales of Arise pretty well. I think the only thing that could make me like this game more is if it had a good soundtrack, but alas, Motoi Sakuraba did the compositions on this one, and it's as drab as all his other Tales of soundtracks. He's a brilliant composer who phones it in so fully on just this one series, and it's really a bummer. But hey, whatever. It's still a magnificent game, and if you haven't gotten into the Tales of series, this is a great place to start. So that's it! All the PlayStation consoles and my favorite games on each. What do you think? Any of my picks match up with yours? Let me know what you'd put for each one down in the comments. Once again, if you'd like the video to help it reach more people, I'd really appreciate it. And if you'd consider subscribing, that would be amazing. Anyway, until next time. Bye.